Shortly. Okay, so for our keynote luncheon today, we are honored to have Professor Kimberlé Crenshaw. I'm going to read a short bio and then I'm going to invite her to the podium to get started. So Professor Crenshaw is a professor of law at UCLA and Columbia Law School and Centennial Professor at the London School of Economics 2016 to 2018. She is a leading authority in the area of civil rights, Black feminist legal theory, and racism in the law. Her articles have appeared in the Harvard Law Review, National Black Law Journal, Stanford Law Review, and Southern California Law Review. She is the founding coordinator of the Critical Race Theory Workshop and the co-editor of the volume Critical Race Theory, Key Documents That Shaped the Movement. Professor Crenshaw has lectured widely on race matters, addressing audiences across the country, as well as in Europe, India, Africa, and South America. In 1996, Crenshaw co-founded the African American Policy Forum, a gender and racial justice legal think tank, which houses a variety of projects designed to deliver research-based strategies to better advance social inclusion. In 2011, she founded the Center for Intersectionality and Social Policy Studies at Columbia Law School, which aims to foster critical examination of how social structures and related identity categories, such as gender, race, and class, interact on multiple levels, resulting in social inequality. She is a leading voice in calling for a gender-inclusive approach to racial justice interventions, having spearheaded the Why We Can't Wait campaign and co-authored Black Girls Matter, Pushed Out, Over-Policed, and Underprotected, and Say Her Name, Resisting Police Brutality Against Black Women. Please welcome Professor Kimberlé Crenshaw.
Thank you. Thank you for that warm welcome. I think this is the first time I've ever given a talk after having cut the rug dancing. I was upstairs with y'all enjoying myself. This is wonderful. I'm so happy to be here. I want to thank my hosts. I want to thank Gwen's Girls and the Black Girls Equity Alliance for bringing me into this space to talk with you all. Very special thanks to Kathy Elliott for, let me tell you all the things I want to thank her for her generosity, her excellent coordination, her incredible patience. So my best friend is with me here today, and she knows that Kathy's been trying to get me to come to Pittsburgh for about 3 years. Has that been right? About 3 years. And I'm going to tell y'all something. Some of you might notice. I grew up about 90 minutes some way, Canton, Ohio. So I was like, oh, I'll get around. Canton, is Ohio in the house? Well, all right. So it's kind of like coming home. So I always knew we were going to work it out. So I'm really happy to be here. And it's also just an incredible honor to share this podium with my sisters in this particular struggle, Doctors Monique, Doctors Venus, Doctors Jamelia. Please give them a hand for their incredible work. We were, just sharing some updates with each other, and I have to say that just 5 years ago, trying to have this conversation about Black girls was virtually impossible. It was something you had to do in the side space. You had to affirm, first of all, that you were down with Black people, which generally meant men and boys, and then you could have a conversation somewhere else in the back room. So you have done an amazing job in bringing this into the front room. And it is a project, it is a program, it is a demand that I have seen happen and I hope will continue to happen across the nation. And I'm so honored just to have the opportunity to be a part of this. I just got here last night. I've been following the tweets and following the conversation, and I know that you've been talking about some of the issues facing black girls and more broadly black women. And while you've been talking about it, across the nation, other things have also been happening that amplify what you've been talking about. So I'm sure some of you followed the fact that 2 6-year-old black girls were arrested and handcuffed in Florida. 6 years old. Kathy shared with me the video of the black women who were beaten at a gas station. You may have followed the report just today of a young black girl assaulted, called ugly, and told she shouldn't have been born. This happened at a Christian school at which the vice president's wife currently works. Now, this vitriolic anti-blackness and its utter lack of restraint in expression against female bodies is a singular representation of the intersectional vulnerability of black women and girls. Now, although these snapshots of black girls and women, and by this I include all femme-identified people, are perhaps sad realities with which many, if not most of the people in this room are familiar, the importance of aggregating this data and pairing this data with the real consequences of what we can see all around us are critical steps in building the will and the capacity to address the tragedies that our daughters, mothers, sisters, grandmothers are all facing. At the same time, these realities standing alone are not enough to prompt meaningful action. We know that black women and girls have historically faced twin realities of hypervisibility on the one hand and hyper-irrelevance on the other. We exist in American consciousness. They see us. It's not that we're invisible, but we're not seen as a constituency, a group that actually matters. At least is not as much as it should matter to those who are responsible to us and for us, to our nation, to our communities, to our families, and even to ourselves. We say black girls matter, but looking at the policy terrain, looking at the political mobilizations that purport to address race, gender, and class inequality, one has to wonder, do they really matter? If black girls matter, why are they afterthoughts in most racial justice discourses about academic underachievement, about criminalization, about the school to prison pipeline? If they mattered, wouldn't their vulnerability to violence, institutional, interpersonal, and state, particularly at the hands of the police, figure more prominently in feminist and gender justice frameworks? If black girls mattered, wouldn't policy and attention to the women that our girls are going to become, their issues and challenges across our entire life cycle, motivate our communities to focus and reverse the ways in which our mothers and grandmothers work, worry, and weather themselves to death, waiting for the support that most likely will never really come? When being a black woman is a risk factor for so many preventable diseases, when social death leads to physical death, can we really say that black girls and women really matter? I believe that black girls matter. I believe that black girls matter is more than a hashtag, but it's not yet a reality. It's an aspiration, it's an imperative, it's a demand, but to make all of this into meaningful action, it's essential that our frameworks for understanding the work ahead are productive and they are compelling. Here is where intersectionality shapes my own thinking about the circumstances that face black women and girls across all of our differences and our vulnerabilities. Intersectionality is first and foremost a frame. It is a word picture. It captures how the material dimensions of vulnerability are shaped by dynamics that are often overlapping and compounding. But spelling out our material vulnerability is only part of what intersectionality brings forward. Equally significant is the ideological and political arena in which social problems are too often framed in ways that marginalize the ways that black women and girls experience racism, sexism, and class inequality. When we look at how discrimination, violence, and economic vulnerability are framed, black women are seldom front and center in that picture. The question then that intersectionality raises is, what underlying investments continue to marginalize our lives? And importantly, what we must do about it to ensure that our lives matter. Now, I'm going to speak somewhat schematically now, sharing just some observations about the de-mattering of our lives across a few key social moments. I'm going to start with a quick primer on intersectionality, and through that frame, I'm going to suggest that intersectional erasure has to be taken on consciously and unrelentingly for us to build the capacity to make black girls matter. And I'll end by sharing a video capturing one effort to ensure that black girls matter really and truly in a way that is more than a hashtag. So, intersectionality is a frame. Social realities become meaningful or not simply because they exist, but because the way in which they are framed. A frame tells us everything we need to know about a social problem, who is responsible, what should be done about it, and what will happen and who is implicated if nothing is done about it. Now, before I talk about black women and girls in a frame, let me bring some friends that I travel with to help me make the point about the meaning of a frame. Now, I could say these cows probably are here in Pennsylvania and Ohio. They're anywhere where cows graze. And what I'm going to tell you is that these cows are sick, and I'm going to ask you to tell me who's responsible for the sick cows. Now, thank you. So you know what, most of the time when I do this, I have to remind audiences, I come from a call and response culture. But now I'm in this culture. So exactly. The farmer. So everywhere I ask this question, all around the country, all around the world, people say that the farmer is responsible for the cows. And when I say, well, you know, the cows, let's think about the cows as social problems. Let's think about sick cows in terms of inequality, underemployment, violence, wealth inequality. When I tell them these are the problems, they'll still say, well, they are responsible for their own problems, right, within this frame. And you ask people to start generating arguments, they'll say stuff like, well, the equivalent of things like, they are grazing in the wrong place. They're not turning off the TV enough to read to their kids. There are not enough bulls in the herd. All of these are explanations for sickness or disease that is painted as inequality. But now, if we broaden the frame, and you see a wider picture, and I ask you who's responsible for the sick cows, what will you tell me now? You will tell me that the corporation is responsible. If I ask you what will happen if we don't address the sickness in the cows to everyone else who lives there, what will you tell me? You will tell me that their health is completely and totally dependent on yours and vice versa. We live relationally with one another. So frames tell us everything that we use to determine how to think about a problem, what to do about it, who's responsible. Now, intersectionality is also a frame. It's a frame for thinking about inequality. It's a frame for thinking about racism and sexism and other forms of injustice. It's a frame that began with black women. Black women who were suing an auto plant claiming that they, black women, had been discriminated against on the basis of both their race and their gender. They argued that both of these factors operated together to ensure that they would be excluded from good jobs and from promotions. But the court hearing the case understood discrimination in a narrow frame, like that first picture of the cows that I showed you. It argued that because the firm did hire black people, albeit men, and did hire women, albeit white, that Emma DeGraffenreid, the plaintiff, and all of her black sisters couldn't prove race or gender discrimination. So purportedly, what happened to black people was all summed up by what happened to men. And what happened to women was all summed up by what happened to white women. There was no space in this framework to see how black women were suffering from the industry structure and its policies. So intersectionality was simply an effort to frame discrimination differently, so its consequences on black women could be better seen in order for it to be addressed. It imagined that the company and the society more broadly was structured by race and by gender, like roads in an intersection. And the policies and the practices were the traffic on those roads. Because black women and girls were socially positioned where those roads overlapped, they were subject to the traffic that was flowing through both of them. This caused a range of injuries at those intersections. But most important was that those injuries were rendered irrelevant when the ambulances arrived and determined that their injuries couldn't be traced solely to racism or solely to sexism. Now, in wider society, it is the parallel discourses that purport to address inequality on the basis of race, gender, and class that constitute those ambulances that don't pick us up when something happens to us as a consequence of all of those things. So when feminism or anti-racism are non-intersectional, they abandon black women and girls in the same way that the courts have abandoned women who seek employment discrimination remedies. Now, black girls, women, and trickle-down justice is the problem that I want us to really think about. All of the previous presenters here have chronicled black women and girls facing all sorts of challenges in success, in school, in life, and in work. Yet when the conversation turns to youth at risk, we're hard-pressed in the mainstream discourse to see girls. It's certainly not because they aren't facing enormous obstacles. That's what you've been talking about. It's often that it's hard to see and credit them because the dominant frames exclude them from the first place. Take suspensions and expulsions. We've been talking about that. Now, of course, it's a national disgrace that undermines the life chances of boys of color. These and related concerns spurred a national crisis intervention program under the Obama administration called My Brother's Keeper. The program initially raised $200 million to address the fact that, as the president said, boys of color are facing a particularly hard time. This is true. They are. But the metrics of hard time completely overlook the crisis facing girls. In one very short study that the AAPF did in collaboration with several scholars, including Priscilla Ochen, Jyoti Nanda, and Monique Morris, we found that in Boston and New York, black girls were 10 to 12 times more likely to be suspended than white girls, a greater risk ratio than black boys face compared to white boys. Our focus groups told us that girls who were suspended were facing punishment in ways that were for infractions and behaviors that were disproportionate to both their black male and white female peers. Their suspensions put them at further risk for long-term consequences, including, as the National Women's Law Center has found, economic hardships that surpass the consequences for boys and men who graduate without high school diplomas. More broadly, not only was the welfare of girls overlooked by frameworks that focus exclusively on boys, but the relationship of mothers to the well-being of their kids was completely marginalized. While in other policy issues, such as the needs of working women and beyond, marriage equality as well, while all of those focused on making life better for the families that we currently have, by that I mean single-headed families, same-sex families, the policies focused on what they need. But when it came to addressing racial inequality, the focus was on repairing what has been framed as a deficient family structure in the black community. So black girls and women are doubly marginalized in this ideological framework, both as children in crises, they're not seen as being in crises, and also as mothers-to-be who are struggling in an economy that underinvests in their role as primary breadwinners for the majority of their families and undervalues them in the economic workplace. Now, while it is clear that as the president positions the well-being of children turns on the welfare of their mothers, this is just a fact. Not so much, it seems, when it comes to the relationship between the welfare of black children and their mothers. Now, this ideology has a long history. It stretches back to the Moynihan Report. That report framed black families as being in disrepair, largely due to the outsized role of black women, their role in working, feeding, and supporting their families, and their role as being leaders in their communities. Now, at a time when gender is supposedly losing its normative and limiting influence in society, it is deeply troubling that when it comes to race equality, our understanding about the role that black women ought to play and our appreciation for the role that black women do play hasn't moved much beyond Ozzie and Harriet in the 1950s. As a consequence, the crisis facing girls and women will continue to struggle for mainstream recognition. It raises the question anew of whether the black girl is now the new face of intersectional erasure. So how do we understand this politically in order to address it? Well, first, we have to confront that the bipartisan coalitions that have been driving a gender-exclusive distribution of resource and concern is based on a gendered political assessment of fear. Namely, it's a coalition of conservatives who are willing to come to the table because they fear black men and boys, and a group of liberals and civil rights leaders that come to the table because they fear for black men and boys. Now, with the tragic life consequences for so many black boys and men looming in the background, the fear for them is real. The problem is that this formula for political action leaves nothing for black bodies who are scorned rather than feared. Black girls and women, as I've set forth in examples earlier, don't escape racism's wrath just because we are women. Quite the contrary. We are victims of violence, both direct and ideologically driven policies, like the attack on public benefits for poor families. When the means of public control over us involve the retraction of benefits rather than building prisons, there's little room for bipartisan efforts to address the vulnerabilities that face black women. Like the first slide of the cows that I showed you, the crisis is seen as not a we problem, but a you problem. Deeper still is the way that this initial framing that excludes girls shapes the research, the policy, and mobilization in a circular loop from which there's seldom a way to escape. An entire industry developed in the late 1990s and the early part of this century that framed racial injustice in exclusively male terms. This framing seeded multi-million dollars, consortium, commissions, and reports, all following the questionable assumption that girls and women were doing just fine. Not only did it overlook some of the ways that girls were not doing just fine along the very same axis that boys were struggling, it also completely overlooked the unique challenges that girls faced and boys did not. So in our focus group, sexual harassment, trauma outside of school, caretaking responsibilities, early parenting, predatory male behavior, all contributed to gendered conditions that made school attachment more difficult to sustain. But these factors do not sit well within a frame that isn't capacious enough from the very beginning to include them. It's even worse. When girls are inside the frame, they still often are not seen, or their conditions are not credited. Recently, the Washington, D.C. School District announced a plan to create targeted educational opportunities for boys of color, including summer jobs, incentives, like an opportunity to read President Obama's book with a male mentor. During the ceremony announcing the project, the D.C. public schools pointed to data that showed how poorly black boys were doing in school. Yet it was black students overall that were doing worse than all of their peers. Black girls who were right beside them in the data were simply not mentioned. So racial justice discourses that marginalize girls and women are not unique to public education or to public policy. In the wider cultural arena, the struggle over violence, both state violence, which has been the focal point for racial justice, and gender-based violence, which has been the focal point of feminism, have both been slow to broaden the frame to address the vulnerability of black women and girls. As I've frequently seen around the country, when asked about names such as Tamir Rice, Philando Castile, Mike Brown, Eric Garner, there's not a place that I go where the majority of people do not know those names. But when I say the names Michelle Cusseau, Tanisha Anderson, Natasha McKenna, Ara Russer, these are names that the majority of people do not know. The only difference between these names is that the first set of names were men killed by the police, and the second group, women killed by the police. It is because of this silence, this erasure, this failure to lift up these particular vulnerabilities that we began Say Her Name. Say Her Name came from a moment when we were marching with thousands of people in New York in 2014, lifting up a banner in the Eric Garner March that included the names of upwards of 18 black women who were also killed by the police. Many people marching with us were shocked to find out that women too were killed by the police. Some felt that we were interlopers in a framework that was just about black men and black boys being killed by the police. Some believed that it was just a myth, it didn't happen. They did not know the reality that we now know, that women and girls as young as 7, as old as 93 years old, have been killed by the police. They've been killed on the streets, they've been killed in their cars, outside of their homes, in their living rooms, in their bedrooms, and even in their beds. They have been killed when police raid their homes on mistaken warrants. They have been killed when they or their family members have sought help. They have been killed when men they were with were targeted. They have been killed when they are alone. As women, they have been killed driving while black, shopping while black, having a mental disability or an emotional crisis while black, being homeless while black, being poor while black. Black women have been strangled to death, beaten to death, tasered to death, and shotgunned to death, sometimes beaten and shot repeatedly, sometimes at close range, sometimes in the back. The vast majority were unarmed, and very few were engaging in any activity that remotely justified the use of deadly force. That they were women does virtually nothing to counter the claims that deadly force against them was justified. They were described by police as superhuman, as posing by the simple look on their face, a threat to the well-being of police officers. No matter their condition, their age, or circumstance, they are never the damsels in distress. They are never women in crises. They are never women in fear. They are seen as social problems that needed to be aggressively manhandled and punished. Now, this vulnerability to police violence is a condition that black women share with black men. It's a condition of occupying a social category that has been defined in terms of their threat to the social order and in terms of their own moral failure. But what black women do not share in common with their brothers, at least until now, is the likelihood that their death will ever be exemplars of vulnerabilities of black people writ large. There are no mass demonstrations. There were none over the death of Natasha McKenna, even though her death was filmed and released supposedly to assure the public that the officers who tasered her to death were entirely professional in doing so. And no one knows the name of Tanisha Anderson, who was killed by the Cleveland police just a week before Tamir was killed. There's barely a mention of Melissa Williams, a passenger who was killed when a police officer mounted the hood of the car she was riding in after an engine backfire led them to chase the couple and discharge their weapons. No sustained advocacy for Maya Hall in Baltimore, even though she was killed just days before Freddie Gray. We cannot wait, because the experiences of Black women with police violence and state surveillance extend well beyond shootings by police, but also to sexual abuse by police and others who have authority over our well-being, including state agents such as landlords, guards, and others who can coerce or extort sex, as they have the consequence of the power that they have over women who are racially, economically, and socially marginal. We know that sexual abuse is the second most common complaint against police officers. And we also know that Black women are more likely to be in a vulnerable position to be threatened by sexual abuse. Yet, the reality is that for the most part, when we think both about police violence and anti-racist agitation against that, and when we think about feminist agitation, Black women and sexual abuse do not come into mind whatsoever. The work at the Forum has been to draw attention to these vulnerabilities. We've done so through word puzzles, for example, the names of Black women who have been killed that are not readily available, that we have to work in order to see. That's why it is a word puzzle, to create the necessity to actually look deeper in order to see what is in plain sight. We also spent time supporting many of the women who were sexually abused by Daniel Holtzclaw. Some of you might know this case. He was an Oklahoma City police officer who was accused of raping 13 women, convicted of raping 8, now serving 263 years. He's seeking appeal now on the grounds that the women who testified against him were not credible, relying on exactly the same stereotypes and disregard of Black women's veracity and sexual autonomy that allowed him to believe he could rape them with impunity in the first place. Why? Because these women are Black, they are poor, some of them are homeless, some of them are chemically dependent, some of them were involved in the sex trade. These are precisely the stereotypes, these are precisely the realities that make Black women more vulnerable to this kind of abuse. Yet, when we went to Oklahoma City expecting to see civil rights groups, women's groups, we saw ourselves. Why is this? It's a framing problem. It's a framing problem. Sexual abuse against Black women by police is not seen as racist police violence. Sexual abuse of Black women by police is not seen as interpersonal, gender-based violence. So once again, we're up against the realities that frames tell us what problems matter, frames tell us who matters, frames tell us what we need to do as a society to address these issues. Last but certainly not least is the question of class. And here again is a framework that overlooks Black women who are there in plain sight. Let's look at politics for a moment. Now, I know many of you have heard, and forgive me if I step across a political line, but it's just this time in our history. Many of you have heard that the reason why the current occupant in the White House is in the White House is because economic hardships that were overlooked by Democrats in the zeal to recruit voters of color left those workers who were having a particularly bad time out. So the votes for the current occupants were votes by people and from people who were being left behind by the economy, by politics. So it was this and not xenophobia that drove this shift to the Trump campaign. But if it was really downward and deteriorating social economic conditions that explained this move, if that's what explained a vote for Trump, then black women would have been at the top of the list voting for Donald Trump. Let's be real about what's happening. African Americans have lost 50% of their net wealth in the 21st century, and black women have lost most of that. The median net wealth for black women is less than $5. Think about that. Less than $5. Wealth is everything. Wealth is what gives us security. It's what gives us health. It's what gives us the capacity to provide for oneself and loved ones in sickness and old age. Much, if not most, of the conditions that we've been talking about, that we've considered, are connected to wealth deficits. And it is largely a racial wealth gap, as white women have a median net wealth of about $42,000 or so, and black men have a median net wealth of about $7,000. But when it comes to discourse about class, when it comes to who is hurting, when it comes to how politics now should be driven by the working class, the obvious subject and sympathy and understandable angst in this moment is not black women, it's white men. So black women, of course, are seen as economically distressed, but they're not valued as political actors who are mobilizing political agendas based on their own assessment of which policies and priorities matter most to them. So across race, gender, and class, the well-being of black women and girls has fallen outside of the mainstream agenda setting and political mobilization. And painfully, this is traceable to dynamics that are little close to home. We often know too little about what is happening within our own communities, and efforts to collaborate to lift up these issues sometimes become bogged down. Often overworked and underpaid advocates are too often overwhelmed to hold this lifting, which makes the occasional appearance of competition and distrust that can sometimes infect even the best intended relationships all the more damaging. We know there's no option but to speak into these silences in order to build awareness and imperatives to resist the marginalization of black women and girls. We at AAPF have been undertaking a project called Breaking the Silence to help facilitate an honest engagement between and among girls and women of color across the nation, to assist efforts of community groups to grapple with the hidden in plain sight issues that this forum here has elevated. Gwen's Girls is part of a national movement to bring what was once into the shadows into the light. I want to share here with you a clip from our town hall, both to leave with a concrete reflection of how the links between the work being done here and across the nation animate each other, and to give us encouragement for the road that we have to travel ahead. So, with that, let me show you this video.
In 2014, President Obama launched the My Brother's Keeper initiative, a $300 million public-private partnership to empower boys and young men of color. Under the My Brother's Keeper Community Challenge, dozens of cities across the country have pledged to support local initiatives for boys and young men of color. In January 2015, Washington, D.C. announced the Empowering Males of Color initiative, a plan to invest $20 million in programs for Black and Latino male students. While many boys are at risk and require these interventions, the gender-exclusive focus doesn't take into account that all children in the Black community are at risk, as data in D.C. and nationally show. Washington, D.C. is not alone. Communities across the country have taken up education reform in a manner that excludes the urgent crises facing girls of color, both in school and out of school. Nationally, black girls are being suspended from school at a rate 6 times that of white girls. We know that disparities in school outcomes increase women and girls' risks for trafficking, financial insecurity, and incarceration later in life. Since January 2014, the African American Policy Forum has partnered with local organizations throughout the country to bring the experiences of young women of color to the attention of policymakers and community leaders. Here are some of their stories.
Now, the women who stepped forward and the girls who stepped forward to talk to us today represent and stand in for the voices of those who we often forget. The women and girls that are not doing just fine. The women and girls who've been told that they should wait and that their issues can be written off. But their stories, many will be told here for the first time, remind us that our future rests not just with our boys and our men, but also with our women and girls.
To explain the conditions of the DC public schools system, I have written a poem called Resource Denied. My teacher says our homework is on page 62, but we have no books to take home, so what am I to do? Resource denied. Our classwork is on the computer, and we are to have it done by 1, but there's only 3 computers per 25 students. How can I get work done? Resource denied. I'm having problems with math. There's no tutors, and teachers aren't available after 3:45. If I fail, I'm afraid other students will laugh. Resource denied. Today I had a meeting with my mother, teachers, and principal. The principal says, you don't turn in homework, you don't complete class assignments, and you're failing math. What do you have to say? I looked at my mother, and then at my teachers, and then turned to my principal and simply replied, resource denied.
While substituting, one particular third grade girl stood out to me. She sat in the corner by herself, disengaged from the lesson. Though she separated herself at moments, she would go take a classmate's item and just return to her seat with it. Her classmates kept telling me how she just got on everyone's nerves and got in trouble with all her teachers. As I began to speak to her, she told me no one liked her. She hated her school and that everyone teased her and she didn't know why. After talking to the school's administrators, they shared that she had moments of aggression related to the trauma of molestation and trust issues that ensued from the experience. Rather than helping her to continue in the learning process, she was often sent out of class or verbally disciplined to settle down. Although administrators were aware of the problem, there was no protocol or help in place to ensure this young girl could process through her hurt, abandonment issues, and abuse. Instead, when her coping skills failed, she was disciplined, which reinforced her earlier traumas.
Again, I was 13 years old, and I did not have any knowledge of how to navigate these types of destructive relationships. I desperately wanted to tell someone, but was afraid of the repercussions. And so each day, I walked to school and home with a butcher knife in my backpack in case my boyfriend turned abuser attacked me. Now, at that time, at 13, I wasn't much different in stature then than I am now. I've always been a dark-skinned, chubby, nappy-headed black girl. Those are descriptors that I use with much pride now, but they were also sources of torment as I was bullied mercilessly. One of my young tormentors thought it amusing one day to take my backpack and dump the contents onto the floor. A hall monitor saw the knife, immediately alerted the school police officer and the principal, and shortly thereafter, I was handcuffed and taken to the principal's office where my mother was summoned. As I waited for my mother, I attempted to explain to my principal why I was carrying a knife, that I was afraid for my safety and wanted protection. My concerns were promptly dismissed as I was told that my justification was preposterous. When my mother finally got to the school, she was justifiably horrified, as the principal was advocating for my expulsion. After much back and forth, they came to consensus that I should be suspended for 2 weeks. And I'm only so lucky in that even that circumstance that I had a mother who could leave work to advocate on my behalf.
I think we leave that trauma with Black women. We're supposed to stay silent about that trauma. And I feel like that's an issue and that carries on because I stayed silent about my mental health until it got to a point where I felt like killing myself would help me. It would end all the problems, and it really didn't. And it is that stigma with foster care that I see every day. Like, I'm being told, don't tell people you're in foster care. And I'm like, why should I be ashamed of that? It's like that stigma about getting help. Black people are like, don't go get help. You can do it on your own. I'm supposed to go to school, look happy, be okay, but be homeless. I don't understand why, as a Black woman, I'm told to be silent about my issues. I can't go to school and then go lay on the street and say I'm fine with that. And that's an issue.
The school system and their securities or their police officers make it no better. You have nobody to run to from coaches, securities, police. They're all sleeping with kids. But because the football coach is a CSI man, activities director is his wife, principal cool with them, you can't turn and talk to nobody because it's their word against ours. And they're gonna believe their friends before they believe a little Black girl. So things need to change.
I started high school in 2006, and I went to girls' high school, Philadelphia High School for Girls. Upon entering this school, I found a community of people that supported me and had shared experiences with me. And so I decided to come out to a small group of my friends as bisexual. Upon coming out, I found that the staff and administration at that school was extremely homophobic and biphobic. Staff and administration often over-police the actions of students that were either perceived to be or listed as being LGBTQ. And when that happened, students would receive in-house suspensions for anything from holding hands or hugging. Such simple interactions would get girls suspended. And so even in such a diverse school, I noticed that these suspensions and these arguments were disproportionately affecting girls of color. And I didn't understand at the time how this could come from a Black woman as the principal.
Despite the fact that girls born in the United States are bought and sold every day, our law enforcement, our child-serving agencies, and our communities still refuse to see these children as victims and survivors. They are the children in our child welfare systems. They are young girls between the ages of 12 and 14. They are girls who have been pushed out of school, or girls who are missing school and are labeled as truant when they should be labeled as exceptionally vulnerable or critical missing. If we think about who falls within these populations, especially in the District of Columbia, then there should be no surprise that the vast majority of victims of domestic child sex trafficking are girls of color. I personally have more stories than my heart can hold of girls who have been raised to believe that they are disposable, expendable, and only valuable when they are the property of someone else. Instead of telling these stories, I will end with the names of 3 baby girls who we failed, who I knew and loved, and for whom no one marched or held vigil. Erica Whitmire, Sharnice Rains, Tamiko Bridges. Thank you.
I'm here tonight as both a mother and an advocate. My 6-year-old son is just down the hall. I need to start here. Our love and fear for our sons is real, but mine knows who both Michael Brown and Marissa Alexander are. If we're going to build up our communities, it has got to be about both our sons and our daughters. The schools are not doing enough for either our daughters or our sons, and the solution to that problem is not just a school for boys. It can't continue to be about boys doing worse, because that fuels a lie that all our black girls are doing well. The testimony you've heard this evening paints a starkly different picture from the idea that girls are doing well. The solution has got to be better schools all around. Better schools for all our kids.
So let me leave you with a parting thought. I encourage you to think about what it would sound like to have a hearing here in Pittsburgh, in which much of the data that has been collected and talked about today actually comes to life in the actual lives and testimonies of black girls, given to policymakers, elected officials, people who ought to be accountable to us in this community. That's one of the beautiful things about bringing us together. I'm going to end with this. All of us black girls who are now black women have probably been in institutions where we at some point were that bad little black girl. I know I was, right? I was a bad little black girl in a largely white Christian school where I was constantly objecting to the way Christianity was being deployed to denounce freedom struggles. You know, I was the one that got sent to the principal's office for talking about the Black National Anthem. I was the one that got sent to the principal's office because I had a little too much attitude and a kickback in my little cheerleading little routine that I did. It's like, that's not appropriate for girls in our school. And you know, the only reason they tolerated me was that they had to, because I represented them in the academic intramural competition. So it was an unhappy relationship on both sides. But I know I was lucky, right? Because I came of age when the violence of repression wasn't institutionalized. There were not school resource officers in the school that saw my acting out as arrestable offenses. I came out when I wouldn't be expelled for calling out my teachers' racism, or when their resentment of me didn't metastasize into an effort to destroy the rest of my career. I came of age when escape was possible, and my upward momentum wouldn't be interrupted, but in fact was protected by the lioness that was my mother, Marion Crenshaw. But a lot of us were not so lucky then, and more of our girls are not so lucky now. So the responsibility is on all of us to galvanize our energies, galvanize our outrage, our skills, our dedication, to make it our commitment that black girls matter is not just a hashtag, it is our and their reality. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Crenshaw. So we literally have time for 1 to 2 questions. Write them down, hold them up. Right. Okay, here we go. We study the problem, we talk about the problem, we know about the problem. What action do we take to eliminate the problem? What do we need to be doing as school board members, community leaders, parents, and advocates?
Why don't we get 2 of them, and I'll do them both. Let me get this one for you. Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, do you have suggestions for community-based nonprofits and researchers who center black girl perspectives to get the attention of and influence local policy makers?
Okay, great. So I'm basically going to probably just rehearse the last 5 minutes of what I just talked about, right? Because number one, I think, you've heard from the experts, so it's not as though we don't know what to do. The question is how to generate the political will to make it costly not to do it. That's really the problem. Look, black women have mobilization power. We put presidents in the White House, right? I mean, that was us that made that happen. So the question is, and it's what I said earlier, do we have a framework that allows us to see that the problems that our girls are facing are problems of racial injustice, gender injustice, and it is a priority for us to deal with that. So one of the reasons why we did the town hall, and we have been doing them all over the country, is it's one thing for us to know it, it's another thing for us to put it to the people who claim to represent us that they have not. They have failed in their responsibility to us, and this is precisely what we want them to do. So what happens with the town halls is the testimony is going to the Board of Education, the mayor, the commissioner, the people who actually have to show up, and they have to sit immersed in our reality for a couple hours, listening to what's going on in our lives and bearing witness to the particular things that we are saying. This would make a difference in our lives. And at the end, they are asked in less than 2 minutes to tell us concretely what are they going to do following up on this town hall. So it's not enough to say, I see you, shake a hand and leave. No, they have to say, I hear you, this is what I'm going to do, and this is how you can hold me accountable to it. The accountability is up to us. We got to get them to show up. We have to give them what it is we want them to do, and then we have to hold their feet to the fire to make sure they do it. Thanks.
Thank you so much.